or one of our assignment?
That's for the first thing we're going to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagined you have questions about that. And uh, if way back when we started, there's another pop-up. Why am I getting pop-ups? Something must be unplugged here. I have a backup drive that's being a little problematic. It keeps buzzing at me. Okay. Well, there it is again. All right. I just started the recording, so it'll have me fumbling around with a backup drive on the front side of it. So don't worry about that. Yeah, you want to know when you get feedback. Well, we're going to process that slightly differently in that I'm hoping over the next 2 days that all of you can find a small period of time, half hour, something like that, that we can have a one-on-one individual conference that I can kind of talk you through my suggestions as opposed to sending you a document that's got comments and things like that on it that you have to kind of figure out, what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to tell you, and you can't do the kind of the sort of follow-up questions that you might like to ask, and instead of going back and forth like that, I thought that would be the appropriate thing to do. And obviously the deadlines are sort of meaningless at this moment. I'm thinking that there'll be a draft around the 30th. And after the 30th, if there's a problem or if there's things that absolutely need to be redone or need to be finished out or whatever, then you'll have until the 8th to do that. And that's about as far as I can stretch that because I think I have to post grades on, when do I post grades? On the 10th, yeah. 10th, yeah, the 10th. So, that'll give us a little time to play with that. But what I would like to do is to do these brief little conferences. I said half an hour, it could be longer. I mean, we just, we'll make sure there's only 6 of you. So we'll make sure that we don't back, anybody up to anybody. And so think of sometime over the next couple of days, shoot me an email tonight, tomorrow morning, whenever. I'm going to be in this house, not leaving for the next 2 days. And, so we can do those things. And then we'll think about a time, say mid next week sometime, where we'll do the same thing again. And maybe we'll include the time frame and, well, anytime next week, but basically once you've had time to process and, do a couple of things that maybe you think you need to do. I didn't see anybody's idea that was unworkable. I saw a few that are unfinished. By that, I mean the idea is essentially there, but it's not there in a way that's defined and doable. Um, you know, there are some buzzwords that people use that show up in the vernacular and show up in the literature and things like that. And we always think we know what all those words mean. And, great many times we don't. And so we have to go back and think about being a little bit more definitional. But anyhow, when we talk one-on-one, we'll kind of, talk about that. And the fact that this is a sort of a mini prospectus, these things are not as detailed as I would expect, if you were doing an actual prospectus for a dissertation or something like that. There'd be a lot more detail in it. But you know, we'll try to highlight those things that you would want to make sure that you have, you know, enough detail on, because when uh, you do a prospectus for, you know, a couple of different reasons. One is kind of a proof of concept. You know, here's an idea. Here's um, kind of the rationale behind it. And here's why it's something worth looking at. And here's why it's important in your particular field that you look at this or look at these things. And then the second part is, okay, how do we sort of define that uh, in a way that will allow us to actually look at something meaningful? And it's that's the most difficult part. And you know, if you were you know, a doc student that I was advising, or I was a member of your committee or whatever, we'd be going back and forth basically about every week, just kind of seeing where you are. And okay, well, here's have you thought about how you're going to define this? Have you thought about how you're going to get some clarity on this idea over here? And so it, you know, the process is as much as important as the sort of the product at this moment. But it does take that back and forth, Michelle, we were just talking, and I was mentioning to him, instead of just sending you a document with feedback, I've got, you know, notes that I've made on each one of them. But I'm wanting to do kind of mini conferences, one-on-one conferences in the next couple of days. If we can find a half hour somewhere in there that works with your time. I mean, my time is, as I say, I'm not going anywhere. So as long as we don't have a conflict, maybe we can, if you have ideas now, we can sort some of that out before the end of class, or you can stick something up in the chat, and we'll kind of look, you know, is that something that's doable for me and doesn't conflict with anyone else? The only conference I know that I have between now and the end of the week is I'm meeting with a new advisee, dissertation advisee on what time is that? Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning. You know, and so don't even, you know, don't limit yourself to work day if you think that, you know, well, I can't meet, but I can meet at, you know, 7:30 tomorrow night or whatever, you know, that's fine too.
I can meet after class, to be honest, but I was just gonna ask, is our due date for this Friday still in effect?
No, it's it has been altered to next Friday, and we'll do another we'll do another sit down next week after you've had a chance to kind of think through some of this stuff, and then we can kind of go from there. Yeah. And then a final due date of May 8th for a final draft. So we'll have two conferences between now and then a, you know, a kind of a submission next Friday just to see where we are. And, you know, if everything's great and wonderful next Friday, that's fine. We'll just say, okay, that's good. But, you know, if it needs a little bit more, then you have until the 8th to work with that. And I say two conferences, it could be as many as you want. I mean, we can talk as much as we need to about this.
Well, I was getting a little worried because we hadn't heard from you, so I was beginning to worry a little bit. But I also thought, I knew we were going to see each other today, so I figured if you were still living and good and everything was groovy,
yeah, I'm still living. I'm
from there.
And it's all good. And one thing, if you haven't learned anything about me, is, you know, I don't
sweat the small stuff.
I don't worry a lot. I'll tell you when to start worrying if you need to start worrying. But you know, right now I don't. You know, I kind of look at where we are right now and how to get you where you need to be. And you know, if we go back and forth after the semester, that's fine too. If you still have an idea that you're kicking around, you want a little bit more feedback on it, that's fine. This is what I do, is research methods and research design. So are we okay with that sort of model? Okay. I asked you to read a couple of articles I had put up, the two articles specifically related to gender. And I want to kind of take a look at those to pull out some little threads in them that I think are useful. But first, I want to, you know, as we get into them, we'll kind of want to think about your perceptions of them, and you know, kind of what you gleaned from it as you looked at those. And I guess it really doesn't matter what order we do those in, but you know, the more generic one is the one dealing with identifying genderedness in higher education. And it's the one that, let me get over here. Identification of institutional genderedness through organizational operations. And this one's based around community college environments. It was published in the NASP journal about women in higher education by Routledge. And as I mentioned, one of the authors is someone that I worked with on the instrumentation just a little bit, just because I had met her at a workshop that I was at. Well, actually, I guess it was more than a workshop because it was a week long, but it was a postdoctoral thing on advanced statistical analysis that was out at Stanford. Yeah, I'll throw Stanford out there, so you know, I'll drop some names. But she was at that same workshop, and you know, you in a week long playing around with the advanced statistics, you just kind of go a little nuts after a while. And so we were just sitting around talking about, you know, projects that were underway, and she had this project, and she said she was trying to figure out the instrumentation on it. And you know, I told her I'd be glad to take a look at it if she you know, wanted to, and you know, didn't need any credit or anything like that. I'd just, you know, play around with it. So we when this article came out a year or so later, I thought it was kind of an interesting take on this idea of understanding the nature of institutional genderedness, which is a topic that we are dealing a lot with these days. And this was kind of on the front end of it, because this was, you know, just a few years ago, but it was one of the kind of a piece of research that a lot of people looked at. And then the other gender research was one that Precious and I did a little bit further back, where we were looking at what we could glean from the teacher working condition survey that North Carolina does, which, by the way, they stole a draft of that from me because I developed it for the state of Virginia for 2 or 3 years, a couple of years earlier, under a grant we're working with. And the folks in North Carolina kind of lifted that one from me. So about 70% of it was my work, and 30% was how they screwed it up. But anyhow, I'm not bitter about that, because they really did screw it up. It became something that was only a shadow of its usefulness. But anyhow, so I have a connection to, you know, to these in lots of different ways, not only instrumentation, but also the one with Precious. I did all the data mining and the analysis and all that stuff for her, for the article. But yeah, so what was your take on this? Now, don't get caught up in the sort of the technical elements of it. We'll talk about the one about genderedness first. And it was a mixed methods. I mean, they had a component of it that was built around the survey instrument they were doing. But within that survey instrument, they're also collecting some open-ended types of information, and had other data sources that they were dealing with. And so they did a mixed methods approach. It was a fairly large sample size. They had about 900, I think, in the sample. I don't remember the exact response rate they got, but it was a pretty good one, pretty legitimate response rate to kind of deal with. So in terms of technical, it was a fairly well put together article, I thought, and nicely done. So what were your thoughts about that particular article as you read it? Just to give me a general overall sense of what you gleaned from it, and are questions that it kind of raised in your mind.
Well, I'm going to say I'm looking at it now because this completely slipped my mind from the past 2 weeks. So.
Okay, well, that's fine. Others get a chance to read it.
I did not, but it's very similar to the topic of my prospectus. So.
Yeah, I thought that was, when I looked at it, I thought, okay, well, she's kind of getting at the same thing here. We have done a lot of work, and I won't belabor the point, but we have done a lot of work identifying some of the issues related to gender and related to gender and leadership and gender, kind of the, well, for lack of a better time, kind of the glass ceiling effect that we still see in higher ed. And yeah, I'm not sure it's exactly that, because it's a little bit different than how we typically define, the glass ceiling notion. It's a bit more of the notion that we assign women into roles at the community college that typically don't end up going into the senior leadership direction.
Right, and currently we have only 30% of our presidents are female.
Mm-hmm. And how much of the the staff would you say are female? Ballpark it.
If we're talking of executive level, I like VP and up, I don't know. I haven't done that count yet, because that was one of the things that was going to be my next step. Support level, predominantly female.
Yeah.
Yeah, director, coordinators on down, definitely predominantly female.
Yeah. And there's mixed methods. There are mixed messages that you get. The doc student that she just defended and finished her dissertation recently, that I was her methodologist and helped her with the analysis and all that stuff. She was doing this survey that dealt with agency and basically the interpersonal communications. It was an instrument that a guy has developed out of somewhere, Ohio, I believe. And she was using an instrument, and it had a fairly unique way of being analyzed. I mean, you had to do some strange coding and stuff like that, but what you end up with is a score for agency and a score for interpersonal communication, our community. And she was looking in an industrial organization, but she was looking at differences between males and females as they went up through the organization, and kind of the how they progressed and how it was related to these scores, these agency scores, and these I guess it's a community score. It's really more interpersonal communication, but it's about sense of community and things like that. And what she found interesting was that, in their training sessions, in their executive training sessions, and she was a junior executive, so in that industrial setting, entered that track. And in their training sessions and the mentors that she had, female mentors she had in her early career there, and she's been there like 9 years now, they always talked about, you got to be more forceful, you got to be more dynamic, you got to project yourself more, or you got to do all those things, which is related to agency. And there's a distinct difference on scores between agency and the sort of community score at the lower levels. And then when you go on up, and males tended to have higher agency scores, so they tended to progress a little bit further up. But when you got to the very top of it, not only did you have to have the difference at the top between 1 or 2 levels down and the very top level, was not agency, it was this community score. And so the thing that women were strongest in was the thing that they were not being encouraged to develop at the bottom. Now that's where we kind of left that dissertation. That's got a lot of potential implications for it, because it basically, you can make the case that we're kind of misdirecting female leaders and female executives, and as to how to progress, and whether that's an artifact of trying to address a different workforce and a different set of folks that we have to deal with, or whether it's an intentional sort of process, a systemic flaw. She didn't get into that. That's the next step of the research, is to figure out, okay, why is this happening? Why are we telling women that they need to do a certain type of thing when that's really not how they're going to get there?
Well, maybe it's if that's the pathway that previous one, it depends on who's the they that's saying that she needs to develop more agency, or be more, basically take on more male characteristics.
Yeah, essentially.
Can you share how she explained agency or defined it?
Yeah.
Just in general.
Let me look in a folder right here. Still got her stuff on my desktop, I think. Yeah, there it is.
I actually think that like the collaborative nature that tends to be typified by female leaders is actually more beneficial for the community college environment.
Yeah, I think it would be too. I think that's maybe we're beginning to see a little bit of that. Okay. All right, I found something. Let me share this up, and we can kind of talk through those scores just a little bit. Okay. Now, if I can just find the share button, where have I hidden that? There it is. Okay. Yeah. Here's kind of an idea of what's in this thing. This is called the circumplex scale of interpersonal values, and it has all these questions, and for example, this first one is when I'm with him, her, them, it is that I appear confident. And you rate yourself from 1 to 4, with 1 being mildly important to me and 4 being extremely important to me. And so, it's a scale that looks like that. Now it's 64 items, 65 items. Let me see if I can get to the next piece in this thing, which is where it talks about the actual scale itself. What did I lose? Let me stop the share so I can see what I'm doing here for a second. Okay. Okay, there it is. Bingo, found it. Let me share that little piece up that. Okay. Here are those definitions. She was looking for this particular scale generates 4 different definitions or 4 different interpersonal values, and the 2 that she was interested in, and the 2 that she was interested in, which are the 2 that are listed here under her definitions, is agency or agentic scale. Sometimes it's referred to in the literature as agentic, or it can be referred to as agency. Agentic derives from the term agency and represents a person who demonstrates assertiveness, competitiveness, and independence. And the other scale she was interested in was communion, and communion derives from the term communal or community and represents a person who demonstrates nurturing and sympathetic characteristics. And so she had, those 2 scales she was looking at. She had a initial sample of about 700 and some, and she got about 400 responses on it. And it went to, males and females that were that had been engaged with the company and had been at lower management to mid-management level positions, or upper level management positions, upper level positions, executive positions. And so she was looking to see, what the differences were between people that were successful at the lower levels and people that were successful at the higher levels, and whether that difference intersected with gender. And so it's kind of one of those intersectional sort of notions. I mean, that term now has been co-opted to mean intersectional in terms of gender and ethnicity a lot, but it's a broader term, and it talks about the characterization or the categorization of an individual across 2 different dimensions. And you consider those 2 dimensions to be what in the literature is called orthogonal. Well, basically you just consider them to be, kind of at 90 degrees to each other. So you have a scale on agency, and you have a scale on communion, and then you have location in one of 4 quadrants. And that's how, that's kind of how you define things. But in this instrumentation, but what she did discover, as I just mentioned, is that males had a higher agency value early. Females had a lower or higher communion value earlier, And they were encouraged to be more agentic and develop their agency skills, to be more forthful, more forthright, more competitive, all those things that have to do with agency. And not reinforcing their stronger skills, which might be in more sympathetic, more nurturing sort of notions. And so, you know, it's the typical male strong leader versus the nurturing. And what happened early in the industrial setting, I suspect it does in the educational setting too, though we haven't got that far with the research, is that females, because of this stronger communal perspective, communion perspective, track themselves or are tracked into jobs and positions that, you know, favor that sort of nurturing, sympathetic sort of interpersonal value that they tend to be stronger in. And realize we're not talking about individuals here. We're talking about, you know, broad categories of tendencies. And that, you know, males tend to be tracked into the more, you know, assertive types of position where their competitiveness and assertiveness and all like that would make them more successful. But what happens when you get to the top, it's those males that also have this strong communion score, or have gotten better at it, or have, you know, sort of worked on that part of their interpersonal values. I don't know how you work on your interpersonal values, but I guess you do. And so they had, you know, they ended up being on the very tip top, but they got there through a path, you know, through a path that had, you know, fewer bumps along the way. You know, while females are trying to come out of the path that tends not to be lead towards senior management, senior executive, males were kind of in that shorter path, females were going a longer path. And so, you know, what happened at the top was this big difference between, you know, how we had valued different interpersonal values at different levels. So we don't, you know, I don't know what all that means yet, but yeah, Jennifer, it does sound like that's a lot of kind of where you're going. And we've done a lot of research on, you know, there's been a fair amount of qualitative research done, not much quantitative. A fair amount of qualitative research done on trying to figure out what those conditions are under which females are kind of not progressing as fast as males in some positions. And, you know, they tend to focus on the systemic things that we all know about, you know, having families and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, if it's purely a function of, you know, females taking, you know, focusing on family maybe for a few years in the middle of their career or whatever, then it would just simply mean that females might get there a little later, but they get there. But the fact is that maybe they don't get there. And so you can't blame it purely on that. You can't blame it purely on, so it's, you know, I think we're trying to figure out a lot of research in that area. And now we're beginning to do that with the instrumentation to try to figure out, you know, a little bit more of what's going on. Yeah, but it's, you know, that was this idea of what these folks were doing with this article was, you know, what is it that we define genderedness? How do we go about, and what is it? What are the conditions under which we define genderedness? You know, when we say that an institution is a gendered institution, what does that mean? Yeah, does that mean that, you know, there is a bias there? There's an intentional bias, a systematic bias. I mean, what's the nature of the bias? And, you know, that's the more difficult question to answer. You know, what is the nature of the bias? What can we, you know, how can we work with this? Thoughts about that? I mean, I'm the old white male here, so, you know, I don't have the right perspective or the right answers on this, but, you know, I'm interested from a research perspective in trying to figure some of that out, because I think, I had sons, but now I have granddaughters. So, I want my granddaughters to have their best shot, and so it is, it's always been, I've always, most of my female friends are all feminist, whether they're closet feminist or rampant feminist, they're all feminist. And my wife is one of those more genteel feminist, but she's very much feminist, but she doesn't like to confront people except me about that. So, so I kind of have that perspective a little bit, but I don't have the perspective you have.
I feel like I'm always a little jaded on this topic because I worked in an elementary school, which is all predominantly white female.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved to the high school, which had more males, but still female.
Mm-hmm.
And now at the community college. So I've never worked in a private sector. I've always been in the school system. So I feel like some things that I see might not be a representative of what the rest of the world sees, because I know education, especially in the lower grades, is fairly dominated by females. So, and like, I guess my college president is one of the 30% Jennifer talked about, because our community college president is a female. Like my dean's a female. I've kind of run into these positions where my supervisors have been females. Like, I feel like I'm not a good representative sample.
Well, I mean, you look at App State, as a total. I mean, you have female chancellor, a female provost. I have a female dean. I have a female department head. Two of the deans, two of the 5 deans, I think, are female. A lot of senior management is female, and so I think there are places where it occurs, but it may be that the glass ceiling is just a little bit higher, because you get to the state level and you find that the senior management at state level tends to be a little bit more male than female.
Right, because we've never had a system president for the community college that's been female ever.
So it's just a matter of where the glass ceiling gets placed. And in public schools, it's the superintendency, because you kind of go up, and at the superintendency level, there are a fair amount of female superintendents out there, but predominantly they tend to be male. And females are predominate the director of instruction, but director of instruction tends not to be the track that superintendents necessarily come out of. And so it is one of those things that the glass ceiling is there still in organizations that look like it's broken through. It's just at a higher level.
Well, and I was going to say too, one of the reasons I totally gave up on being a part of school leadership at all was because I knew that they would never give a woman, or in my county, they'll never give a woman a class 4A high school. It's always been males. Now women run the smaller high schools and the specialized ones, but that's not where the money is. Let's just be quite frank and honest, and so I just realized that I will never get past being an AP at that type of level high school. So, I diverged and went a different path from what I originally thought I might do. And I think the glass ceilings, it just kind of depends on the area, one, but also the area within the organization too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting to say that, because that's what's happening here. So we have a female superintendent, and so one of the largest schools in our district is now ran by a female principal. So I've watched our district change the gender balance. It went from unbalanced on the male side to now unbalanced on the female side.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing to watch. And I've I've observed the people at App, you know, it's been kind of interesting to watch the transition at App, and that's happened very quickly. I mean, yeah, we had our first, you know, female chancellor, what, 5 years ago, 5, 6 years ago. And, you know, you would like to say that chancellors like to have their own people in place, but they'd never say that. They'd never say, you know, I'm going to hire my own people. But it is kind of interesting that most of the upper management, upper level executives at the university now are female. And you know, it's kind of like the chancellor decided, okay, you know, that we're gonna try that. We're gonna see what it looks like and see how it turns out. And so far, it's been pretty successful for her. And so I don't see any reason that she won't continue. She's always going to hire a competent person, highly competent person. But you know, among highly competent people, you know, there are lots of males and lots of females. And the imbalance had always been toward the male. And now, if anything, it almost, like, you know, Jermaine, like you were saying, it's almost swung the other way, because now the imbalance seems to be at the female level. And so if I were a young, eager, middle level dean or something like that, you know, I might be thinking, have I gone the wrong way? Have I taken the wrong career? Or do I need to find a state or an institution that's still kind of backwards? You know, I would obviously never do that, because I think you have to understand that, you know, these culture and societal values and all evolve, just like, you know, evolution works on those too. And evolution is a fairly slow process until you get one of those breakthrough mutations. You know, if you think about the, you know, birds, at what point do birds become more efficient as, you know, because birds came from dinosaurs. And at what point did it become more efficient for dinosaurs not to be as big, but to be able to fly? Well, it became efficient. That had been developing all along, evolution over millions of years. But at the point at which they developed wings that were strong enough to lift them off the ground, then the evolution speeded up like that. And so if you study evolution, it's a slow process, except for when you have one of those breakthrough mutations. When you have one of those breakthrough mutations, and it's like zoom. And yeah, I think organizations will work like that too, and societal structures work like that. It's just, what's the flashpoint? What's the point at which you know, we began to, you know, change in meaningful ways, and not just, you know, little bitty changes here and there. So I think that's kind of what we may be seeing with the gender issue. I'm not sure about I'm not sure about the black-white issue. I'm not sure, you know, you would think that we've had plenty of opportunity for that flashpoint to have occurred. And, you know, we keep looking for, you know, what is that flashpoint? And I sure hope maybe the George Floyd and the trial and all like that becomes part of that flashpoint, but I don't know whether it's occurred yet or not. I don't know whether the systemic pieces are there or not. And so, you know, the evolutionary thing, you know, it happens inevitably, but it's, you know, does it happen now, or is it 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, or, you know, did it happen a while back and we just didn't notice it? I don't know. But I do think with the gender issue, we're a little bit further ahead, maybe, in that evolution. I don't know, but there's still that glass ceiling, and some of that is generational. Yeah. They say there are about 23 years between generation. If you look at an industrial model, you see that most of the senior leaders are today in their 50s and 60s, if not a little older. And they tend to be male. Well, think about the world in which those males grew up in that are 50 and 60. I mean, they're like me. They grew up in the 50s and 60s. And so, you know, you grew up in a world in which a lot of these things that we now would not accept were easily acceptable. And so this focus on gender is in the research. You know, I encourage as many male and female budding scholars to look at this that want to, and I encourage you to do that, because I think it is that's how we figure out what we know and figure out what might be doable. And just like Jermaine, you're talking about this notion of disruption, which is part of the critical race theory. And you know, it's a key part of the critical race theory, but the problem in the research is always that how do you define what that disruption looks like? I mean, what are the actual changes in the workplace or the changes in a culture or society that occur, so that you can measure them? You can say, okay, well, this is where we were over here, and now this is where we are over here. Until you can define that, and the qualitative work has been done to try to define that. Now we need to figure out can we develop instrumentation that will allow us to kind of see what's happening there, see if it's occurring. So that's, you know, these things, as I mentioned earlier, there is a certain amount of precision, a certain amount of definition that we have to get to, because, you know, that at that point, then we can actually do something. We can know what to do. I mean, that's, you know, right now we don't know what to do, because you know, we can't live in a society where it's a zero-sum game. You know, where there are winners and losers. We have to figure out a solution that provides you know, winners all the way around. And I don't know how we get there. But I'm old. You're there. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so that's where my struggle is with what I would like to focus on is what is the thing to measure that will determine my presence impacts on other shifts. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens, but I'm trying to identify what are some things to put in place that can measure that.
Yeah, and you can do that quantitatively. And that's another reason that I picked this particular article to look at, because they're essentially doing the same thing, except they're focusing around gender as opposed to ethnicity or race. And it was, you know, asking people a set of questions that will allow you to try to begin to figure out what are the things that are distinguish these differences. And where did they draw from? They drew from the literature. They drew from other literature on you know, genderedness. And so they kind of developed, okay, here's a list of 100, you know, whatever many things. I forget how big their survey was. Wasn't all that big, I don't think, but here's a list of things that we want to ask about, because those were the things that had popped up in other people's work and other literature. A lot of it qualitative. And in a lot of qualitative stuff, when you have like survey, when you're doing limited sample things, you know, you're only going to maybe look at 6 or 8 or 10 people when you do qualitative work the way it's supposed to be done. The process of coding is really a process of categorization. So if you have, you know, 6 or 8 people that have a common coding about something, or in a group of 6 people or 5 people or whatever that you've done in-depth interviews, and then when you go through the transcripts and you start doing your coding, you realize that there's similar coding categories that show up among all these people or most of these people. then that becomes something that you want to look at. You want to spend a bit more time looking at. And in this particular article, basically what they did is they pulled from the literature out there to identify those things that had been indicated or had been indicated that these might be indicators. And so then they did the survey and did the scoring on the survey. And so there's really kind of almost a two-step process, and that's why this was a mixed methods thing too, this article, because they were looking to think about, how can you figure out how you define what is genderedness in an institution. And they went about it in a mixed methods, but the survey was their primary quantitative methodology to try to move from the coding categories that had been identified in the qualitative literature to a more fixed set of categories that then they could explore in a more quantitative setting or more focused qualitative setting. So, well, gotten completely off track there, didn't we? That's okay. I'm gonna, well, let's go to that article. And I know you have, maybe you haven't read it, but take just a couple of minutes or so and read through the abstract, the paragraph at the beginning. It's really an abstract. It's not cited as an abstract, but it's ERIC requires that you do a description, which really is an abstract when you look at what they require to have in it. So, take a moment or two and just read that, and then we'll talk about that in just a little bit more detail. And if you don't have it in front of you here, let me throw the share screen up. Okay. Had a chance to look it over? Okay. Beyond the methodology and it's a pretty solid methodology. So I would encourage you to, if you get a chance to give it a look-see. In particular, Jennifer, you might like this one since it kind of fits right into what you're talking about. But, it was basically a survey, and they surveyed women because they weren't really interested in male, opinions on this, because what they ended up in the end, what they were trying to do was juxtapose what they actually identified through their survey with the perception that women had. And so the survey kind of quantified for them the nature of any genderedness in the institution. but the open-ended pieces to it and things like that were more qualitative looked at the perception of individual women. And so, you know, the last two lines there, last two sentences really sort of sum everything up. You know, community colleges appear to be gender neutral environments with equal opportunities for both sexes. And then, but the perception of the women in the study indicated a marked disagreement about the practice of gender neutrality in the workplace, indicating that genderness existed in these institutions. And so it was kind of the conflict between what the measure they had developed, the survey told them about genderness, and what the women that actually answered the survey perceived about gender equity.
So let me make sure I understand this correctly. So the survey told the researchers that there was no genderedness, that it was a gender neutral environment, yet the open-ended questions showed something different.
Showed something different.
Okay.
And indicated to them that, you know, women perceived that it was not, perceived that some of them saw it as gender neutral, but, you know, a lot of them didn't see it as gender neutral.
So do you see then that maybe the survey questions weren't asking what they thought they were asking, or is it just their perceptions couldn't be summed up in a, you know, Likert scale answer?
I don't know. Quite
Okay.
possibly both or neither. It might be something else. I don't know. I think it's a it's a complex sort of notion, particularly when you're thinking about systemic influences, because, you know, systemic influences are things that a lot of times we're not really aware of. But when you step back and look at it from a distance, or if you throw out, you know, one of the things about post-positivist thinking is that you never assume that any assumptions mean anything. You never assume that there is any real rationale for why we've been doing what we do. It's just what we've been doing all along. And so, you know, this idea of systemic influences is really something that's kind of grown out of this post-positivist model of modern research. And so, you know, maybe we've made the wrong assumptions all along. And maybe we need to make different ones. We certainly do that in education all the time. I mean, we, you know, we built a high school, or we built a public school model, 130, 40 years ago, and we still operate it today pretty much the same way. That was built around preparing males to go to Ivy League schools. And that's why we always had this tracked notion, this notion of tracking. And we still have it. Just like we have, you know, 5 or 6 50-minute periods during a school day, or 4 80-minute periods, or whatever it is. Why? Because we think learning's attached to time and seat. Well, it's not. But still, we systemically build our schools based around time and seat. So what do we do in higher ed that's so systemic that we don't see those influences that should be right in front of our face, but we just don't see them because we trust, you know, some assumptions that have been made a long time ago. I'm sorry, I'm getting all post-positivist on you, which is an odd thing for a statistician and a researcher, but or someone that does a lot of quantitative research, because that's what they need here. but it is that sort of notion about, what are the assumptions that we live with because we just never thought about questioning them. And maybe those are the things that we need to explore. And so I don't know whether this means, that the survey is not a good instrument. Maybe it's a decent instrument. I don't know. I didn't, beyond helping her kind of structure the thing a little bit and figure out, what were the dimensions that she wanted to work with. I didn't do there's a couple of factor analysis things you do and, structured analysis things you do on survey instruments once you develop them, if they're going to be a widely used instrument. And exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis, those are, kind of strange terms, but those are, the research I'm doing now, part of it involves trying to develop an instrument that looks at sense of presence, social presence in distance learning models. And there are 3 or 4 of us at App State and Tech that are doing that. And so I'm all bound up in this instrument construction stuff right now, but it's, it's the type of thing that I don't know that they did here, but, they probably should have, but, we develop a lot of instruments without doing that. So it is it's hard to say, is this, but it does give you a direction for further research. And so I'm going to go way down into this thing a little bit further near the end. And I'll pop it back up in just a sec. Okay. If you want to know my secret for where I'm looking at articles, here's my secret of not having to read all the crap that you see in articles sometimes. Well, shoot. I'm going to have to stop the share because I need to move this article around a little bit. And once you share it, it won't let you move it around the way you want to. Bingo. There we go. Okay. This is at the very end of this article, and it's 2 or 3 paragraphs here. We're not going to read that, but I'm going to basically summarize them very quickly. But I always look at the abstract or the description. Always go to the end and look at the implications for further research, contributions, conclusions, things like that, which is generally a short section near the end. And if it piques my interest, then I go look at the methodology to see if how sound the methodology was. But I'm a methodologist, so that's automatically where I go. And if that looks good to me, then I read the thing. But, even when I'm looking for lit reviews for a piece of research or whatever, I follow the same thing. I look at the abstract, I look at the contribution, implications, conclusion. And if that grabs me, then I'll look at the methodology to make sure it was done okay. And you'd be amazed how many articles I get to that 3rd stage and realize, this is a piece of crap. They didn't really do a very good job of designing this. And so I'm not going to waste my time on it because I can't trust what they found because it wasn't put together well. But in the second paragraph, the findings of the study continue to support that community colleges are gendered organizations. Their hierarchical structures and male dominations of top level of leadership continue to enforce norms and practices that are not conducive to the advancement of women. And that's quite different than their last two lines in the abstract. And so they're making the stronger statement here. And you don't necessarily have to support this with, okay, at the 0.05 level, we found, no, you can say that, you know, kind of our take on this, because they, you know, reader considers this to be the author's take on this. Our take on this is that it's still there. And then they talk about gendered organizational theory holds that practices in the workplace contain normative gender expectations that privilege men and disadvantage women. Well, that's the whole basis of gendered organizational theory, is that it advantages males in the organization, disadvantages females as they rise and sort of going to the upper levels. And then it talks a little bit more about that. And then the last paragraph is really talking about community colleges need to look within themselves to determine if their operational norms and practices support a working environment that is conducive and supportive to all genders. And so it's looking at how basically how they operate, and what are, you know, what's the model of operation, what's the model of management, what's the model of organization. And so you know, it's basically they're saying that community college needs to continue to examine that and to do the research on that, to figure out, you know, what do we know and what don't we know on that. And so that becomes, you know, kind of what you hang your head on with this study, is that basically says, yeah, it's still out there. And so we can't say, you know, it's not there. And so going back to your question earlier, Lauren, maybe it is the instrument. Maybe it is. Because if they come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's still gendered, they're either valuing the qualitative piece of it more highly than the quantitative piece, or they're realizing that their instrumentation may have some bugs in it. And that would be my take. You know, the instrument probably needs to be redone, or, you know, rethought, or, you know, kind of worked through. So that's you know, that's kind of what's in that particular article. And, you know, I thought it would be an interesting one because it does have, there's kind of a theme in what you're all wanting to look at, and whether it's related to gender, whether it's related to you know, race, or whether it's related to educational programs that tend to be gendered, you know, whether it's related in any of those ways, we're always kind of confronting, how do we measure and identify those things? And the other article I gave you, which I don't know that we'll get to necessarily, I've kind of beat this one to death and gotten off track 1,000 times. But the other article that Precious and I did was purely quantitative. And we looked at, you know, survey data, quantitative data from an instrument that goes out to every public school person in the state of North Carolina every 2 or 3 years. And using that, you know, data to figure out whether there were differences between perspectives of leadership between males and females, and or at different levels within the building. And so it was a kind of an interesting take on that. And by the way, in this article, their primary analysis mode was ANOVA, analysis of variance, in that they were looking to, you know, kind of look at a couple of different things as independent variables at the same time. and how the scores on the survey came out. Questions, thoughts, comments? Okay. Let me go over here. Let me just mention the other article real quickly, because, and we'll do the same thing. We'll look at the abstract, and we'll look at the end of it, because you get a couple of different notions here. Once again, I do encourage you to read the whole thing so you can get a sense of the methodology. The primary methodology in this one, after we got a data set, and getting to a data set, don't worry about that part, because that was an issue with looking at large scale data sets, and this data set had about over 100,000 subjects in it. An issue in looking at a large scale data set is that you almost have too big an N. In fact, you have too big an N, and the statistics begin to break down if the N is too big. And so we needed to get a smaller N and a more balanced N, because when you look at the number of males versus females in public schools in North Carolina, I mean, it's greatly, inflated toward the female side in schooling. And so we had to somehow get a balance of ends, but at the same time, bring it down in size from, essentially we went from over 100,000, I think 103,000, something like that. And our final sample set was around 7,000. And after we got down to even that, after a little data mining that I had to do, it even got smaller than that. And so we got it down to a workable number where the statistics still worked. And it was, pretty convoluted process, and good because nobody asked me too many questions about it, because they couldn't quite figure out what I was doing with it, but it worked. That was all. That's all I wanted to tell them. And so let me pull that up just a second. I promise we'll go here in a little bit. And don't you hate it when you're trying to slide a screen over and all it does is pop it out and go full screen? Okay, here we go. Now I can find it. And this was one that Precious and I did back in 2012. So I guess almost 10 years ago. And it got published in School Leadership and Management, which is an international journal out of England. So let me bring this up a little bit more. Okay, and this is the kind of the abstract. Purpose of the study. We get down here. The study used an analysis of variance technique on a sample that had been selected through some data mining and propensity score matching, blah, blah, blah. Forget all the language there. The study revealed that the gender of the respondent did not have a significant difference on teacher perceptions of leadership among public schools in North Carolina, although the role of the respondent was significant across all dimensions. Now, what does that mean? We found that males and females didn't differ on how they saw leadership in the public schools. What differed was the role within the school, whether it was principal, assistant principal, teachers, or other staff, support staff. So we had like 4 categories there, I think. And we basically found that gender was not an issue in different perceptions of leadership, but position was, role within the school was. and that the interaction of those two were significant and showed that females in instructional administrative roles had higher scores on leadership variables than males, but females had lower scores than males in other roles. In other words, if you were a female responding to that survey, and you were in an instructional role or administrative role, primary roles within the school, then you had a higher perception of leadership in the schools than did the males. In other words, you thought that schools had better leadership than the males felt that they did. And that was kind of a different take, because, you know, when you look at all the literature basically said all along that, you know, it was related to, you know, gender was a primary component of that, of perceptions of leadership. And then quickly flip to the bottom, near the bottom. Now our conclusion, which is also paragraph, I tend to write one paragraph conclusions, because you want to be able to put it on a bumper sticker, sort of thing, something like that. The purpose of the study, blah, blah, goes through all that, and basically repeats the abstract a lot. But at the bottom, this interaction demands a closer look so that simplistic attributions to gender can be dispelled and replaced with more complex and defensible logic about the nature of effective leadership in schools. The study points the direction for future research that could investigate the relationship between several variables that impact school leadership. And basically the one we looked at, the North Carolina teacher working conditions sample, was a rich data source to do that with. But here's what the state of North Carolina did as a result of that research. This was based on the 2008 research, 2008 data. In the next one they did in 2010, they took all the demographic questions out of it because they didn't want us to be looking at demographics in the research. And so things like time in school and, you know, how long you had been in a leadership role versus, you know, all those different demographic sorts of things, ethnicity, all of that, they took out of the survey because they were afraid of researchers looking at those different dimensions to point out that, you know, there was this genderness that existed within public schools in North Carolina. So I know it was, you know, basically we found that it wasn't purely gender. It was more complex than just gender. But how do we get at, you know, that more complexity if you don't have the data, you know, to get at that? And so, to my knowledge, there hasn't been another study like that done on the teacher working conditions, primarily because you don't have the data, you don't have the demographic data. And the reason for taking out the demographic data was basically they didn't want it to become identifiable. Well, it didn't have names, it didn't have anything like that. Just one, you know, males, females, ethnicity, time, how you got your certification, you know, all those things were interesting pieces of information that we could have looked at predictor models to see if any of that predicted, you know, your perspective on leadership in the system. So we abandoned it, and Precious and I haven't worked together on another article since then, because we got dead-ended on that. We were hoping to do a whole series of these, but we got dead-ended on that, so can't go any further. Thoughts about that notion? No? Okay.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
it makes sense that if they don't want to know, then remove the information that you would not want to necessarily see.
Yeah, I mean, it's an old technique, and if you ever have something in an organization that you want to hide, or you don't want anybody to know about, or you don't want anybody to ask questions about, you just simply don't have data.
So I'm looking at the charts and the tables and stuff, and I see that you talk about the corrected model and the intercept. Can you explain a little bit about that? And if you don't have time, I can totally ask it later too.
Oh, in this one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which chart are you looking at in particular?
I'm on page 270.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
because as we look at this type of like putting information in, I guess that's the corrected model would have been the teacher survey, right? Or am I reading this wrong?
Yeah, well, let me, the education. Oh yeah, okay. I see what you're seeing now. Yeah. Yeah, basically, man, how to say this without getting into any sort of lengthy notion of it. What ANOVA does is that when the software program begins to compute the ANOVA, it makes assumptions about the mean sum of squares. In other words, just like when you do t-test, it's on the bottom of the equation is a little thing called standard error of the mean. It doesn't have all the data to really know what the standard error of the mean is, because you'd have to have every data point that ever been run on that thing to do that. But what it does is it samples 2 or 3 different little random data sets real quickly. I mean, this happens in a fraction of a tenth of a second, and arrives at an estimated standard error of the mean. What's happening in this, and let me pop this up so people will know what we're talking about. What happens in this is that this corrected model it's developed an assumption for what is the total mean square. Because remember, in ANOVA, you have the total mean square, you have the within group mean square, which is random error, and then what's left over when you subtract within group from total is what we expect between group to be. Well, it has to create an estimated corrected model, because it's using an estimated total mean sum of squares based on just a sample. That's about the best I can do right now without going to my other projector over here and putting a couple of formulas up and really screwing the whole thing up as I go through it. And yeah, I'll be glad if you want me to talk about that a bit more or whatever. We can just shoot me an email, and I'll pontificate for a few minutes on it that way. But yeah, there's a whole lot in statistical analysis that is estimated, simply because you're dealing with smaller samples. And remember, these are not random samples most of the time. Now, what I did in this model to data mine to go from 103,000 down to 7,000 was essentially create a random sampling out of a set of data that was not random to begin with. And there are ways of doing that, and it's you know, it's kind of like black magic sort of notions, but it's legitimate, and the journals like it, and they'll accept it, and you know, the Department of Education accepts it when you're doing best practice research and stuff like that. So it's one of those things that they allow you to do, realizing that most of your data is going to come from models that don't have random samples. And so what we did here was to, you know, as we sliced and trimmed the data and figured out, you know, how to get it down to a workable end that didn't have a bias built into it. You know, I created out of theory 2 random samples that weren't biased one way or the other based on gender. But you're always going to have corrected models. You're always going to have estimated models. You're going to have those that'll show up in some of these tables simply because they don't have, they're dealing with samples and they're not dealing with the total population data. That's probably the best I got in less than 5 minutes or whatever.
All good.
Okay. All right. So are we clear on what's happening? You're going to shoot, you know, some thoughts to me about when you might like to try to meet. Michelle, you want to meet right after class? Can we do it Thursday or Friday? Because I know I'm going to get interrupted here in a little while. And I hope it's later, but it could be earlier.
Yeah, we can definitely work that out.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
I'm waiting on a dude to come by and give me an estimate on something, and I've been looking for him for 6 months, and I'm finally got him pinned down to today sometime this afternoon. So I don't want to miss this dude, and because I need a fence so this dog won't run away. And, you know,
I understand. You're good.
I've been told I have to have a fence, a new fence, because if this dog runs away, I might as well go pack my bags and leave too. At least that's, you know, general indication. And so if you can understand that, that's why I can't meet this afternoon.
Okay.
So if you'll shoot me something for the next day or two, anytime, literally anytime, when we can meet for about a half hour, I'll turn right around and commit and give you a schedule, and we'll meet in the Zoom session here in the same Zoom link. I will go through my thoughts about your project and kind of what needs to be thought through a little bit better, and you know, what's standing in the way of it moving forward in a good way. I think all your ideas are solid, and so you can continue the lit review stuff, but don't, you know, we need to kind of think through the methodology piece a little bit better, maybe before you crank into that already. And then we'll work for a draft by next Friday, not tomorrow, not this Friday, week from Friday, and not day after tomorrow, week from Friday. And I'll read those over the weekend, and if I think there's an issue, I'll let you know, and then you've got another week to, you know, fix anything. But I'm hoping that those drafts will be in such good shape that, you know, even if I do have some comments, you won't need to resubmit them, and I'll just mark them up with the comments I have. Because you know, these are things I want you to kind of carry into whatever the next flavor is that you have to deal with, or the next class, or the dissertation, or wherever you're going with it. And so we want to make sure that we get it solidly grounded as best we can. So I'm not too worried about, you know, is this thing polished and clean and 100% what I'd like to see if I were, you know, getting ready to sign off on it or not for you to get into a dissertation. But I would like for you to have the best start on this thing that we can give you. And so I think the best way to do that is to these little one-on-ones. Yeah. At least I think that will work better for me. I hope it works better for you. I mean, I think we can talk about more stuff and we can kind of redirect a little bit here and there, and follow-ups and things like that. So shoot me an email, and we'll get those put together, and then we'll think about the same thing next week. Somewhere around the middle of the week. We will meet next week for a little while to talk about the article, the last article I had up there, which is the one related to presence, because that one's brand spanking new 2020 article, and has had the benefit of having been published in various forms over a period of 5 or 6 years in different journals as we kind of built out the research. And so what that article is kind of the final version of that whole research train. But it also gets into the non-parametric sort of analysis, chi-square, and a little bit of logistic regression, but it also has some other elements in it that are more parametric too. So it's a good one, and it relates to notions of presence in online classes.
Yeah, I saw the open clock picture and it took me back.
Yeah, some of you have seen, the models that we used for the different types of platforms we've had. And if you noticed, we haven't gotten a new interactive platform built out yet because server space. I mean, you're going to eat up gobs and gobs and gobs of server space doing 3D virtual platforms. And so that's why the university has gone back flat to Zoom and all that, because you need programmers and you need all that sort of stuff. But we'll keep trying. Our instructional technology folks keep trying. It's just we don't have anything to go with right at the moment except Zoom. But anyhow, it's a culminating piece of research, because as far as I know, we're not going to extend it beyond this point. This is a chapter that looks at the best research in virtual learning over the last 10 years. So it's a chapter in one of those books. So it's a goodie. But yeah, please try to give it a read. And I think it's pretty readable, pretty straightforward. The stats are not overly cumbersome. I don't think. I'll always try to minimize stat language so that you don't get bound up in that. And we will see where we are after our meetings over the next couple of days, and decide if we need to meet again next week, face to face. I mean, one-on-one, not face to face. So we'll just look at that article. We'll make some, kind of ending comments and things like that. And, I'll make a commitment to you to still work on these ideas after the class is done. If you need a, technical sort of response to something, you can always get a hold of me, and we'll figure it out. We'll figure out whether I can help you with that or not. Okay. So I'll see you next week. I say, shoot me an email so we can figure out the next couple of days. And I said, anytime. If we have an overlap, I'll figure that out real quick and shoot it right back to you, so that, so you might think of, what's a backup? Give me a first time and then a backup, and then we'll kind of do that. All right, folks, I'll see you in the next couple of days, and I'll see you next week. Have a good one, and bundle up. I think it's supposed to be cold and for the next day or two somewhere, at least up here. I don't know about down there.